At 7:23 on the morning of October 14th, 1950, Chief Pipeline Engineer William Stewart stood on the prairie 18 kilometers west of Regina, Saskatchewan, watching the first section of 30-inch steel pipe being lowered into a trench that would eventually carry Alberta crude oil 2,858 kilometers east to refineries in Superior, Wisconsin. 47 years old, 23 years in petroleum engineering. He was supervising the construction of the first major pipeline to transport Western Canadian crude to Eastern markets. A project that would either prove long-distance oil transmission was economically viable or become the most expensive failed experiment in Canadian energy history. The numbers made conventional petroleum engineers nervous. Operating pressure of 1,000 pounds per square inch, a transmission capacity of 95,000 barrels per day. More than any Canadian pipeline had ever attempted. A route that crossed the Canadian Shield, muskeg swamps, and 300 rivers requiring specialized crossings. Pump stations every 80 to 100 kilometers, each housing turbine-driven pumps generating enough pressure to overcome friction losses and keep crude flowing east. Imperial Oil had discovered the Leduc field near Edmonton in 1947, proving that Alberta contained massive petroleum reserves. Subsequent discoveries at Redwater, Golden Spike, and Pembina confirmed that Western Canada could become a major oil producer. But Alberta's population was 800,000. The refineries were in Ontario, Quebec, and the U.S. Midwest. The oil was in the wrong province. Conventional wisdom said tanker trucks and rail cars were the only viable transportation. But trucks and rail cost 80 cents per barrel to move crude from Edmonton to Superior. A pipeline could reduce that to 30 cents per barrel if it worked. Stewart had spent 2 years planning the route, negotiating with landowners, and designing pump stations. His construction crews would lay pipe through terrain that ranged from prairie grassland to Precambrian bedrock. They would work through winters where temperatures dropped to -40. The first pipe section settled into the trench. Welders began joining sections with precision welds that would contain crude oil at pressures that could rupture steel if the work wasn't perfect. The Interprovincial Pipe Line had begun. The problem started in 1947 when Imperial Oil struck oil at Leduc. The discovery ended Alberta's perception as an agricultural province with limited industrial future. A subsequent exploration found reserves estimated at 1.2 billion barrels, enough to supply Canada's entire petroleum consumption for 15 years. But getting that oil to market required infrastructure that didn't exist. Alberta had small refineries serving local demand. But Eastern Canada, where 70% of the population lived, imported crude oil from Venezuela and the Middle East. Canadian oil stayed in Western Canada, while Eastern refineries bought foreign crude. Imperial Oil proposed the building a pipeline from Edmonton to Superior, Wisconsin, where it connected to existing American pipeline networks serving refineries across the U.S. Midwest and Chicago. From Superior, oil could reach Sarnia, Ontario via American pipelines, then be distributed to Eastern Canadian refineries. The federal government approved Interprovincial Pipe Line Limited in 1949. Then construction began in 1950 with William Stewart as chief engineer. The key innovation was pumping technology. Crude oil loses pressure as it flows through pipe due to friction. A 2,858-kilometer pipeline required pump stations every 80 to 100 kilometers, facilities with turbine-driven centrifugal pumps that boosted oil pressure back to transmission levels. Stewart designed 28 pump stations along the original route. Each station housed multiple pumps capable of generating 3,000 horsepower. The pumps had to operate reliably in remote locations where winter temperatures made maintenance difficult and equipment failures could shut down the entire system. If you want to see how William Stewart engineered the longest crude oil pipeline in North America across conditions that made failure seem inevitable, please hit that like button, as it helps us share more forgotten stories like this. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to the Interprovincial. Construction proceeded in sections. Alberta to Saskatchewan completed in 1950. Saskatchewan to Minnesota completed in 1951. The system reached Superior, Wisconsin in October 1950, 13 months after construction began. Chief Construction Supervisor Thomas McIntyre, 51 years old, veteran of multiple pipeline projects, managed the workforce that peaked at 4,200 workers. Crews worked simultaneously on multiple sections separated by hundreds of kilometers. Welders joined pipe with precision welds inspected by X-ray. Coating crews wrapped welds with protective layers. Trenching machines excavated ditches 1.5 meters deep. Progress averaged 3 to 5 kilometers per day on prairie sections. Its work slowed to 1 kilometer per day in the shield where bedrock required blasting. River crossings used directional boring, drilling beneath riverbeds to place pipe without disturbing navigation or ecology. 2 workers died during construction. 1 was killed when a side boom tractor overturned. 1 died from exposure when stranded overnight during a winter storm while working at a remote pump station site. The names: Donald Fraser, 38. James Peterson, 34. The first crude oil flowed through the Interprovincial Pipe Line on November 2, 1950. Alberta crude reached Superior 72 hours later. Capacity: 95,000 barrels per day. Cost: $93 million. The extension to Sarnia, Ontario opened in 1953, creating direct access to Canadian refineries without routing through American systems. The Montreal refineries gained access in 1976 through the Montreal Pipeline extension. By 1980, the system, renamed Enbridge Mainline, transported 1.2 million barrels per day through expanded pipe and additional pump stations. Capacity continued growing as Alberta oil sands development created production volumes far beyond conventional reserves. Today, the Enbridge Mainline extends approximately 4,800 kilometers with over 70 pump stations. The system transports approximately 3 million barrels per day at peak capacity, roughly 65% of all Canadian crude oil exports. That's 126 million gallons per day, flowing east from Alberta. The mainline supplies feedstock to refineries across Ontario, Quebec, and the U.S. Midwest. The Sarnia-Lambton petrochemical complex, Canada's largest concentration of petroleum refineries and chemical plants, depends on Enbridge for 85% of its crude supply. Refineries in Montreal receive 60% of their feedstock through the system. And the entire supply chain depends on pump stations, control systems, and pipeline integrity functioning normally. A prolonged disruption, whether from pipeline rupture in a critical section, coordinated attacks on multiple pump stations, or equipment failures cascading across the system, would immediately strand Alberta oil production and create refinery feedstock shortages across central North America. Alberta producers would shut in wells within days as storage capacity filled. The province produces 3.7 million barrels per day. Losing the mainline's 3 million barrel capacity would force production cuts exceeding 80%. The economic impact to Alberta would exceed $400 million per day. Refineries in Ontario and Quebec would exhaust inventory within 5 to 7 days. Gasoline prices would spike as refined product inventories declined. The Sarnia-Lambton complex, which produces 40% of Ontario's gasoline and diesel, would reduce output or shut down entirely. The 2010 Enbridge pipeline rupture near Marshall, Michigan, demonstrated vulnerability on a small scale. The rupture released 20,000 barrels of crude oil and shut down a segment carrying 240,000 barrels per day. The closure lasted 5 weeks. Gasoline prices in Ontario increased 8 cents per litre. Some refineries reduced operations. A mainline-wide failure would create impacts 10 times larger. The system has limited redundancy. Enbridge operates backup capacity and can reroute some volumes through parallel lines. But total system failure would exceed all contingency plans. William Stewart retired from Interprovincial Pipe Line in 1965 after overseeing expansions that tripled original capacity. He died in 1982 at age 79. The pump station technology he pioneered remains the foundation of modern crude oil transmission. Thomas McIntyre continued managing pipeline construction until 1968. He died in 1991, aged 91. The welding standards he enforced prevented countless potential failures across thousands of kilometers. The Enbridge Mainline operates continuously. Control centers in Edmonton and Superior monitor flow, pressure, and pump performance across 4,800 kilometers. Pumps run 24 hours per day, like maintaining pressure that pushes 3 million barrels of crude east from Alberta. Oil flows through pipe buried 1.5 meters underground, invisible to the millions who depend on the refined products it enables. And somewhere in Saskatchewan, that first section of pipe that William Stewart watched being lowered into a trench on October 14, 1950, is still carrying Alberta crude east, still functioning after 74 years, still essential to Canadian refineries and consumers who couldn't exist without it. The system continues. Canada depends on it continuing. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Our stories about infrastructure that powers modern economies. Real people, real engineering, real economic stakes. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if you've worked in energy, pipelines, or petroleum. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure William Stewart, Thomas McIntyre, and the 2 workers who died building this system don't disappear into silence.